On that October night in 1851, the chains usually meant for cattle took on a different role. Noah Carter's rough hands gripped the iron links as his master Jonathan Pierce swung upside down from the barn rafters under the pale Georgia moon, hanging like slaughtered livestock. The quiet, obedient field hand had finally reached his breaking point. But the question that lingered long after wasn't how Noah managed it. It was why Pierce never saw it coming from the man he trusted most. The Pierce plantation stretched across 2,000 acres of fertile Georgia land, where rows of cotton shimmered like white waves under the autumn sun. Jonathan Pierce moved across those fields with the swagger of a man convinced that God himself had granted him dominion over the soil and the people who bent their backs beneath it. At just 34, he had inherited not only the land from his father, but also an iron belief in the so-called natural order that some men were born to rule while others were destined to obey. Noah Carter walked those same fields with a different knowledge. For 23 years, his scarred hands had tilled, planted, and harvested. He could read the soil like Scripture knew the sound of cotton when it was ready to be picked, and could judge the coming harvest by the way the leaves caught the morning light. But what Pierce considered his property, Noah knew as his prison, a cage he navigated with the precision of a man who survived by anticipating every shift in his captor's moods. October 15th began like countless days before. At 4:30, the harsh clang of the plantation bell ripped through the dark, calling the enslaved to another day of labor. Noah pulled on his worn shirt and stepped into the chill of dawn, his breath rising in faint clouds. Around him, others emerged from their cabins with the weary discipline of people who had learned to conserve every ounce of strength. At his side was Sarah, his wife of 7 years. Though their bond existed only in the recognition of their community, never in the laws that reduced them to property. Her belly was round with their second child, and Noah carried the familiar ache of joy, mixed with dread hope shadowed by the cruel world they lived in. "Baby's been kicking all night," Sarah whispered as they walked. "Feels like this one's got your restless spirit." Noah smiled faintly. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe this one won't accept chains so easily. Dangerous words left hanging between them. In Sarah's glance was the silent acknowledgement of dreams they dared not voice. Dreams of freedom that flickered only in the pauses between heartbeats. From the porch of his grand house, Jonathan Pierce appeared as the workers gathered in the fields. His boots struck the wood with polished confidence, his posture stiff with Southern aristocratic pride. Blonde hair combed neatly. Clothes pressed and sharp, he looked like a man stepping into a portrait, not a field. Morning Noah Pierce called in his smooth, commanding tone. "Check the north field today. Heard the cotton there's near stripped clean." "Yes, sir, Master Pierce." Noah answered, the words falling heavy in his mouth. He had practiced that balance for years, respectful enough to survive, but never fully surrendering the last fragments of his dignity. It was a delicate balance that Noah had learned to maintain, one that demanded constant watchfulness. Pierce nodded satisfied with Noah's obedience and moved along the rows, tossing out orders the way a farmer might direct cattle. His voice clipped and practiced. Noah kept his head down, but his eyes followed, studying the man, cataloging the arrogance in his every step. Pierce moved through the world with the blind confidence of someone who had never once questioned his place in it, never once considered that the ground beneath him could shift. By midday, the sun bore down on the fields with a merciless weight. Noah worked steadily, his fingers moving with mechanical precision, filling sack after sack with the cotton that lined his master's pockets while chaining his own future. The rhythm freed his mind, letting it wander where his body could not. He thought of Marcus, his son barely 5, and already brimming with a curiosity that both filled Noah with pride and left him with unease. The boy asked questions no child in bondage was meant to ask. Just days earlier, Marcus had looked up with those bright, restless eyes and asked why some lived in the big house while others lived in the cramped cabins. Noah had answered carefully, saying different people had different jobs, though the words burned as they left his mouth. But Marcus wasn't satisfied. "Why can't we switch sometimes?" The boy pressed his innocent logic, cutting deeper than any whip. From across the cabin, Sarah's eyes met Noah's, carrying the same question, the same silent ache. How could they explain to a child that the world was built on a lie? How could they teach him to survive without crushing the fire that made him more than just another name on Pierce's ledger? The memory broke when Noah noticed commotion near the main house. He shaded his eyes against the glare, watching as a group of riders thundered into the courtyard, their dust still hanging in the air. Even from a distance, he could see the urgency in their movements, the stiff way they sat their saddles like men burdened with heavy news. Pierce emerged to meet them, his steps quicker than usual, his face set tight. The men leaned in close, speaking in low tones, their gestures sharp and uneasy. One rider pulled a paper from his coat and handed it over. Noah couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. He read the tension in Pierce's shoulders, saw the transformation in his face as the casual mask of authority gave way to something darker. Pierce crushed the paper in his fist, barked a few words that made the men nod grimly, then watched them ride off in a storm of dust. Alone in the courtyard, he lingered staring after them before turning his gaze on the distant fields, his eyes narrowing as if the answer to his troubles might be hidden among the bent backs of his workers. When the sun sank low and the shadows stretched across the land, Noah retreated to the barn. It was his small refuge, a place of quiet where he could lose himself in the simple rhythm of tending to the animals. The cattle greeted him with soft lowing, their presence grounding him in a world that made sense water hay care routine. He moved among them with easy familiarity, savoring the rare solitude. That peace shattered when Jonathan Pierce's voice cut through the barn like a knife. "Noah." There was something in the way he spoke, sharp and dangerous, a note Noah had never heard before. Slowly Noah straightened his hand, resting on the flank of a cow, his body still, but his nerves tightening like a drawn bow. "Yes, sir, Master Pierce," he answered evenly. Pierce stepped into the dim light, and for the first time, Noah noticed the coiled whip in his master's hand, the leather catching the last glow of sunset. Cold dread slid through him, but he forced his face to remain calm, his posture steady, his movements measured. Outwardly, he was the same obedient servant he had always been. Inwardly, every instinct screamed that something was about to break. Pierce's words slid into the air like a blade hidden in velvet. "Had some visitors today?" he said casually, though the edge in his tone was sharp enough to cut. "Men from the county seat. They've been asking questions. Seems there's been talk of runaway slaves, of people helping them move north. Underground Railroad, they call it." Noah kept his face steady, but inside every muscle tensed. He nodded slightly, careful not to betray what was racing through his mind. "I heard of such things, Master Pierce. Terrible business. Slaves running off like that." "Indeed it is," Pierce replied, stepping closer, his boots whispering against the barn floor. "What's curious is that these men believe someone here on my land might be helping them. Someone who knows the roads. Someone the others trust." The accusation lingered in the air like smoke, suffocating and inescapable. Noah felt his pulse hammering in his chest, but he forced his voice to remain even. "Can't imagine who they mean, sir. Most folks here too busy with the work to think on such matters." Pierce smiled thinly, but there was no warmth in it. "Funny thing, Noah. I've always thought you different. Reliable. one of the good ones. But maybe I've been too generous, too trusting. The whip uncoiled in his hand with a soft hiss, brushing against his boot. Noah's eyes flicked to it instinctively, his stomach clenching at the memory of screams he'd heard under its bite. He swallowed hard, pushing the sound of those cries aside. Master Pierce. I've served this family 23 years, my father before me, his father before him. This land's all I've ever known. And yet, Pierce's voice hardened as he closed the space between them. Loyalty is a fragile thing. A man can serve for decades while hiding resentment. While plotting, the barns seemed to shrink around them. The cattle shifted uneasily, their heavy bodies stirring the air as if they too sensed danger. Noah's mind spun, weighing the impossible. Deny it, hope Pierce had no proof. Run and face certain capture, or something else. He drew in a breath. I don't know what you've heard, he said, his voice quiet but steady. But I've never given you reason to doubt me. Pierce's grin widened, his teeth flashing in the dim light. That's where you're wrong, Noah. It doesn't matter what you've done. It matters what men think you've done. And I can't afford even the suggestion of disloyalty from my property. The word landed like a blow, tearing away years of restraint and exposing the raw truth beneath. Property. Not a man, not a husband, not a father. Just a thing. In that instant, Noah saw clearly. Pierce was not just threatening him, he was threatening Sarah Marcus, the unborn child who kicked in Sarah's belly. The whip rose. Noah saw his end in that motion, the death of his body, his dignity, his family's fragile hope. But before the leather could strike, he moved. 23 years of back-breaking labor surged through him, hardened muscles fueled by desperation. He lunged forward, crashing into Pierce's chest, driving him backward into the feed bins. The whip clattered to the ground. Noah's hands found Pierce's throat, fingers digging into soft flesh. 23 years, he rasped, voice hoarse with fury long buried. 23 years I gave you, and this is what I get: threats, accusations. Pierce's eyes bulged, his hands clawing at Noah's grip, his face contorted in terror. For the first time, the master looked at his slave, not as property, but as a man one with rage, with strength, with the power to take back what had been denied him. Please. Pierce choked, the word strangled, and small no longer the command of a master, but the plea of a man staring at his own mortality. Noah's grip on the rope tightened, his knuckles pale in the fading light. Pierce's desperate words hung in the barn, trembling with fear, but they carried no weight against the memories that surged in Noah's mind. He thought of Julia, her scream still echoing on humid nights, the scars on her back, a living testament to Pierce's mercy. He thought of mothers who had clutched their children only to watch them sold away like livestock. He thought of Marcus, so young, and already asking questions that carried the seeds of rebellion. Noah's jaw clenched. Pierce's plea that he had a family, that his children needed him, was the bitterest irony of all. How many fathers had stood on this very land, praying for the same chance to hold their children, only to have Pierce strip that future away, without a second thought? Noah pulled the rope steady and deliberate. The pulley groaned, the chain creaked, and Jonathan Pierce was lifted from the ground. His polished boots kicked wildly, scuffing against the barn wall, a man accustomed to commanding the world, now reduced to a gasping, dangling figure. The cattle stirred, lowing anxiously, their restless movement, filling the silence with an almost judgmental rhythm. Noah's chest rose and fell in ragged breaths not from exertion, but from the sheer weight of what he had unleashed. Pierce's eyes bulged, his lips trembling around words that no longer came. His body twisted, swaying in the dusky light that poured through the slats. For the first time, Noah looked upon him without fear, without hesitation. This was no master, no ordained figure of divine authority. This was just a man, stripped of power, swinging helplessly like the butchered livestock he had so often ordered others to slaughter. And yet beneath Noah's rage, a strange calm settled. It wasn't joy, not even relief. It was inevitability. 23 years of silence had led here to this moment, when he chose not only his own freedom, but the hope of something better for those who would come after. He stepped closer, his voice low but steady, meant as much for himself as for the dying man. Every lash, every order, every life you broke, this is their justice. Pierce's movement slowed his boots, losing their frantic kick. His body sagged and the barn grew quiet again, save for the soft rattle of chains and the heavy sound of Noah's breathing. In the shadows, with the last light of day spilling through the cracks, Jonathan Pierce swayed, no longer the master of anything. Noah stood motionless, the enormity of what he'd done pressing down on him. But in that same weight, he felt something else, something he hadn't known in years. Choice. Noah tightened his grip on the rope and said quietly that his children would grow up free, that they would never belong to anyone or have their lives decided by another man's whim. Then he hauled until Pierce's boots left the floor, and the chain pulled him up toward the rafters. Pierce's face went from red to purple as the iron bit into his wrists and the blood rushed to his head, and he gasped that this was murder and that they would hang Noah for it. But Noah kept working the pulley and secured the knots with the same sure hands he used for the animals. When Pierce warned that his family would hunt him down, Noah thought of Sarah's swollen belly and of Marcus asking innocent questions, and he thought of Julia and every mother who had seen a child sold away. He picked up the whip and tested its weight, feeling it change from a symbol of his bondage into an instrument of reckoning. And then he struck. Each crack landed with the memory it paid for Julia, for the children taken for every morning he had woken in chains. Blood seeped through the white shirt, the scream stilled, and finally Pierce hung limp and quiet, swaying over the straw as the last light slipped through the barn slats. Noah waited, expecting relief, but found only a hollow where the anger had been a sharp clarity that something irreversible had been done. He walked to the door and watched the plantation lights blink on families settling into their ordinary nights. And he thought of Sarah, probably wondering where he was of Marcus, maybe asking for a story. Knowing that discovery would bring a brutal search and that every person he loved would be in danger. He went back and began to stage the scene, forcing himself to focus on the one thing he could still control: the safety of the family. He would never hold again. Noah worked quickly, his knife flashing in the dim barn light as he carved new wounds into Pierce's flesh, deepening some and adding others, each cut designed to muddy the truth. He overturned feed buckets, scattered tools, and tossed Pierce's belongings around the dirt floor, creating the impression of chaos, the story of multiple attackers. When the scene finally looked convincing, Noah wiped the blood from his hands, straightened his shirt, and stepped into the cold night. The air was crisp, the stars sharp and countless above him. He felt them watching, silent witnesses, maybe even his ancestors, judging what he had done. Moving like a shadow, he crossed the plantation grounds toward the slave quarters. At the window of his cabin, he stopped. Inside, Sarah moved slowly, her swollen belly shaping every careful step. Marcus sat at the table, pushing his carved animals across the wood, lost in play. Noah pressed his face to the glass, drinking in the sight, committing it to memory, as if he could carry it with him forever. Sarah looked up, sensing him. Her eyes met his, and she smiled, motioning for him to come inside. But Noah only shook his head. His hand touched the glass, a silent farewell, and Sarah's smile faltered, replaced by confusion, then dread, as she read something in his eyes she could not name. She hurried toward him, but he had already turned away, melting into the night. At the edge of the pines, Noah stopped to look back. The barn loomed in silhouette, a dark secret swaying inside. The cabins were quiet now, the families within oblivious to the storm that was about to break. He turned from it all and stepped into the trees, the pine needles soft beneath his feet muffling his flight. Northward he walked, guided by the steady glow of the North Star, the same beacon that had led so many before him. The Underground Railroad was no longer a rumor in his mind. It was his only hope. He might find help, he might find freedom, or he might die hunted in these woods. But at last, his life was his own to gamble. With each step, the invisible weight of chains slipped further away until he could breathe as a man and not as property. Dawn broke pink and gold over the Pierce plantation. The bell rang at 4:30, as always, pulling the enslaved from their cabins into the fields. To them, it was another day. But young Jacob was sent to the barn to feed the cattle, and his scream shattered the morning air. The sound carried across the fields, pulling workers and overseers alike to the barn, where the grisly sight of their master, hung swaying from the rafters, awaited them. By the time the crowd gathered, young Jacob was doubled over in the dirt, retching into the red Georgia clay. His face was pale, his whole body trembling as he pointed a quaking finger toward the barn door, too stricken to form words. Briggs, the overseer, hard-faced, feared by all, shoved past the workers and disappeared inside. A moment later, his sharp oath rang out, and when he re-emerged, his skin was drawn tight and ashen. "Back, all of you!" He barked, his voice tight with something that sounded close to fear. "Nobody goes in till the sheriff gets here." But whispers spread like wildfire, carried by those who had stolen even the quickest glimpse. Talk of blood pooled dark on the barn floor, chains hanging heavy from the rafters, and Jonathan Pierce strung up like slaughtered cattle. Sarah stood at the edge of the crowd, her hand pressed against her swollen belly, her breath shallow. She had woken before dawn to find Noah's place beside her. Empty, his warmth gone, and dread had gnawed at her since. Now, as whispers rippled and the crowd's faces twisted with horror, dread hardened into certainty. She searched the faces, hoping against reason to see Noah among them, but she knew she would not. 2 hours later, Sheriff Williamson arrived, a thick man on a heaving horse trailed by 3 deputies with rifles at the ready. They vanished into the barn for what felt like forever. When at last they emerged, Williamson's face was grim, his eyes scanning the crowd like a man already settling on answers he wanted to find. "Every slave accounted for," he announced flatly. "Every man, woman, and child. Nobody leaves till I know what happened here." The hours that followed were a crucible. The enslaved were lined up, interrogated, one after another. Their cabins ransacked, their meager belongings tossed in the dirt. A wrong word or a wrong look brought a blow from a deputy's fist or the butt of a rifle. Some were beaten bloody simply for trembling, too much, others for staying too still. Sarah sat straighter than she felt when it was her turn, her voice level, her answers careful. When Williamson asked where Noah was, she met his stare and said she assumed he was in the fields where he belonged. "When did you last see your husband?" he pressed. "At supper," she replied, which was true in its way. She had seen him at the window, had read farewell in his eyes, but she spoke nothing of that. Even Marcus was not spared. The boy sat on his mother's lap, his carved wooden animals clutched tight in his little hands, while grown men questioned him as though a child could hold the secrets of rebellion. His clear voice cut through the barnyard hush when he asked why Papa wasn't there to answer for himself. Sarah's arms closed around him, her voice steady as she whispered that Papa was working in a different field. By afternoon, the truth none dared to speak could no longer be denied. Noah Carter was gone. His tools hung neatly in place. His possessions lay untouched. But the man himself had vanished, as though swallowed by the earth. Tracking dogs from the county seat caught a trail that led into the pines, but it was lost at a swift-running creek. Beyond that, he became a ghost. For days, armed patrols scoured the countryside, pounding on cabin doors, rifling through barns, shouting questions to anyone who might have seen a runaway slave. Handbills appeared in neighboring counties, naming Noah a murderer and offering rewards for his capture, dead or alive. But Noah Carter did not reappear. Some said he found the Underground Railroad, that secretive chain of souls who risked their own lives to lead men and women toward freedom. Others believed he perished in the woods, his bones left to bleach under the southern sun. Whether he reached the north and grew old under another name, or whether he fell to a bullet or betrayal, no one on the Pierce plantation ever knew. In the quarters, his name was spoken only in whispers. Some called him a murderer, others a martyr. But all agreed on one truth. For the first time in his life, Noah Carter had chosen his own fate. And in choosing, he had torn a hole in the order of things so deep that the Pierce plantation would never truly recover. Years later, Sarah brought a daughter into the world during a bitter January cold snap, the kind of freeze that made water harden in the wash basins and the cabin walls groan like old trees in the wind. She named the baby Hope. Some of the enslaved shook their heads at the boldness of it, and Robert Pierce, Jonathan's brother and the new master, made his displeasure known with a tight-lipped scowl. But Sarah never wavered. To her, the name was a prayer, a defiance, and a promise all at once. Marcus grew into a boy who carried his father's absence like both a wound and a crown. Around fires in whispered circles, he heard the tale of Noah Carter repeated in 100 variations. In some, Noah had reached Canada and lived free. In others, he joined the Union Army musket in hand, returning vengeance to the very soil that had tried to break him. Still others claimed he lingered in the deep Georgia woods, a ghostly protector guiding runaways along hidden trails. To Marcus, none of it mattered. What mattered was that his father had chosen freedom over submission. Noah Carter became more than a man, he became a legend. Robert Pierce ruled with cruelty sharpened by his brother's death. The workdays grew longer, punishments harsher, the weight of oppression heavier. Yet in the quiet moments when the whip cracked too loudly, or the sun beat down with merciless heat, whispers spread like embers among the enslaved. Remember Noah? Remember the man who said no. The name became a kind of password, a reminder that resistance was possible even if only in spirit. Years folded into decades, and the story of Noah Carter took root in the oral tradition, passed down like scripture from one generation to the next. It became a story of human dignity refusing to die, of the moment when endurance transformed into rebellion. Parents told their children of the field hand who walked north beneath the stars, choosing death or freedom on his own terms. When the war finally ended, and Union soldiers rode onto the Pierce plantation in 1865, the announcement of freedom carried with it the memory of Noah's defiance. Sarah, now in her 40s, gathered her children. Marcus, grown into a man, Hope walking with her own little ones, and left the only land they had ever known. As they walked the dusty road away from Pierce's house, Marcus glanced back toward the barn, where his father's rebellion had begun. "Mama," he asked softly, "do you think Papa ever made it north?" Sarah's gaze stayed on the horizon, her hand clasped tightly around his. Hope's children tugged at her skirts, free-born children who had never felt a shackle. Sarah's lips curved into a quiet smile. "I think your Papa found what he was looking for," she said. He found a way to be free. In the decades after the war, Noah's story traveled far beyond the plantation. It was told in churches where hymns rose like thunder, in schoolhouses, where children repeated lessons of courage in family gatherings, where history was stitched into memory. With each telling, Noah grew larger, not just a man, but a symbol of resistance itself. The quiet field hand who once labored in Georgia soil became a myth of freedom, a reminder carved into the American memory that even in the darkest night, someone had dared to walk toward the stars. To some, Noah Carter was a hero who struck a blow for justice in an unjust world. To others, his name served as a warning about what happens when the oppressed are driven too far. But to his family, he remained something simpler and more sacred. A husband and father who had loved them enough to risk everything for the fragile hope of a better tomorrow. The barn where Jonathan Pierce died stood long after the war ended, weathering decades of storms, until at last its timbers collapsed into the Georgia soil. The structure was gone, but the story outlived the walls, passed from parent to child teacher to student preacher to congregation. It became less about the night of bloodshed and more about what it symbolized, the moment one man broke the chains of his captivity and claimed his freedom on his own terms. Whether Noah survived to see the end of slavery or died in some hidden hollow of the forest was never known. What mattered was that he chose his own ending, rather than letting others write it for him. He had shown that the chains of slavery were not only iron and steel, but also law, custom, and belief, and that even those could be shattered by the human spirit's refusal to bow. His story reminded people that history is not shaped only by generals and statesmen, but also by ordinary men and women who reach a breaking point and decide to act. As years passed, Noah Carter's name grew into legend. In some versions, he reached Canada. In others, he fought with the Union Army. In others, still, he became a shadow in the southern woods, guiding others to freedom. But every telling shared one truth. He had said no when silence was expected, and in that defiance, he had become more than a man. He had become a symbol. Preachers used his story to show how the powerless could seize dignity from the jaws of oppression. Teachers framed it as a lesson in the moral contradictions of slavery. How a system built on cruelty could twist both master and slave until violence became the only language left. And when the civil rights movement came more than a century later, activists invoked his name as a reminder that progress often requires risk, sacrifice, and defiance. Yet Noah's story was never told as simple triumph. Those who remembered him emphasized that he was not a saint, but a man. A man who loved his family, who labored under a yoke that grew too heavy, and who finally snapped. He was at once victim and agent, hero and warning. That complexity gave his legacy weight. It kept him from drifting into fable and rooted him in the real suffering and choices of real people. Over time, Noah Carter joined the company of American folk figures. John Henry Nat Turner, Paul Bunyan, not quite myth, but larger than life, shaped by retelling, by hope, by the need for stories of resistance. Children heard his name and dreamed of their own moment to stand tall, to reject chains of whatever form held them down. Noah Carter may have vanished into the Georgia pines, but the echo of his footsteps carried through generations. A reminder that even in the darkest night, a man could walk north toward freedom, guided by nothing more than the stars and his will to be free. The barn on the Pierce plantation eventually crumbled into ruin. But long before its beams collapsed, it had become a place people sought out. They came not just to remember Noah Carter, but to honor every enslaved soul who had endured, suffered, and died in bondage. Standing in that hollow shell, visitors could almost imagine the night in October 1851, when the world turned upside down, when a man branded as property claimed himself instead. Historians would argue about Noah's story, what was fact, what was myth, what was reshaped by memory and retelling. But the power of the tale was never in its precision. Its truth was emotional, moral, symbolic. It spoke to the contradiction at the heart of America, the lofty promise of freedom and equality, set against the brutal reality of oppression and injustice. Noah Carter's legacy was not the whip he raised or the life he took. It was the life he chose the courage to stand and act when silence and obedience were expected. He showed that even in the harshest of circumstances, a person could still make a choice, still decide to write their own story, instead of letting others write it for them. The winds that stir the pine forests of Georgia carry more than the scent of resin and soil. They carry whispers, stories told and retold, fragments of memory that refuse to die. Perhaps Noah's spirit walks there, still heading north, guided by the same stars that once pulled him into the night. His freedom was more than a destination. It was a state of being, a refusal to accept the limits placed upon the human soul. His story endures because it captures something universal. It reminds us that history isn't only written by generals or presidents, but also by ordinary people who at the breaking point choose defiance over submission. It is the field hand who refuses to bow the mother, who teaches her children to dream the father who sacrifices everything, so that those dreams might take root. When Noah Carter walked into the darkness that night, he emerged transformed, no longer just a slave in Georgia, but a symbol of resistance itself. The chains that bound him were not only iron, but law, custom, and centuries of belief. And when he shattered them, he revealed how fragile those chains truly were. Generations later, his story was told in pulpits and classrooms, on porches, and in protest marches. During the Civil Rights Movement, his name was invoked as proof that the desire for freedom could never be crushed, that even the most ordinary man could spark extraordinary change. His tale carried both inspiration and warning, that the oppressed cannot be pressed down forever, and that violence once born of desperation leaves wounds even in victory. But the heart of his legacy is simple. Noah Carter's greatest act was not taking a life, but claiming his own. He showed that liberty is not a gift to be granted, but a choice to be seized, even at unimaginable cost. He turned endurance into resistance, survival into defiance, and in doing so became more than a man. He became a reminder carried forward through generations that the human spirit cannot be owned, cannot be silenced, cannot be contained. The bell that once summoned enslaved workers to the fields has long been silent. But the story of Noah Carter still rings echoing like a warning, like a promise, like a hymn. One person, one act of courage can change the world. His story is America's story. Struggle and sacrifice, courage and consequence, the long march from bondage toward freedom that defines the nation's soul. In the ruins of the Pierce barn, where blood stains faded and chains turned to rust, visitors sometimes swear they feel Noah's presence lingering, the echo of that October night when he broke the order of things and chose his own fate. They stand in the silence and remember that liberty is never free, that justice demands a price, that dignity often comes at the cost of blood. Noah Carter's legacy is not about the whip he wielded or the life he ended. It is about the freedom he claimed and the courage that act embodied. His story is a call for each of us to ask whether we would have the same resolve to sacrifice for what we love, to defy what is unjust, to walk toward our own freedom, no matter the cost. The wind still carries his story across generations, whispering to those willing to listen that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they refuse to accept chains. Noah stepped into history on that October night in 1851, but he walked out of it as something greater than history. No longer just a man, no longer just a victim. He became a symbol of the unconquerable human spirit. His tale ends not with neat answers, but with inspiration. Not with finality, but with possibility. Somewhere in the Georgia pines, under the same stars that guided him north, we can still imagine him walking his journey unfinished, his freedom. Not just a place, but a condition of the soul. Yet the road north was perilous. For Noah, the days that followed were filled with danger and despair. He traveled by starlight, guided by the North Star, hiding by day in thickets and abandoned barns, drinking from creeks and surviving on roots and berries. He knew the land like scripture, the ridges, the water patterns, the plants that nourished, and the ones that killed. The same knowledge that had enriched his master now served his flight to freedom. But knowledge could not shield him from doubt. On the third night, slogging through swamp water to throw off the dogs, Noah faltered. Exhaustion gnawed at his body, hunger hollowed him out, and guilt pressed heavier than the night itself. He saw Pierce's face in the rippling water of a creek, purple swollen eyes bulging. Murder. Not in blind fury, but deliberate, methodical. The memory clung to him like shadow. Despair nearly swallowed him then. But the faces of others rose up to meet it. Julia's screams as the whip tore into her back, the wails of children ripped from their mothers, the decades of humiliation he and his people had borne, while others feasted on their stolen labor. In those memories, Noah found the fire to rise again. He had killed not just a man, but the illusion that submission was the only choice. His journey north had only begun. But in those first days of fear and flight, Noah Carter's transformation was complete. He was no longer property, no longer prey. He was a man walking toward freedom, one uncertain step at a time. Ben's eyes stayed fixed on the fire as if the flames themselves held the memory he was about to speak. "Because once, a long time ago, I had a brother," he said quietly. "Not by blood, but by bond. He was a man much like you, strong, proud, with a family he loved. He belonged to the folks down the road when I was a boy. We'd fish together in the creek race through the pines, talk about dreams we didn't understand, we weren't both allowed to have. Then one day his master sold him south. I never saw him again." His voice caught for a moment, then steadied. "That was the day I learned that the world I'd been born into was wicked at its roots. And I swore I'd spend whatever years God gave me undoing even a sliver of that wrong. Every man I help find his way north is a promise kept to him. A promise that not all white men will stand by and let evil have its way." The room was quiet except for the steady crackle of the fire and the scrape of Noah's spoon against the plate. He swallowed hard, not just the food, but the weight of Ben's confession. For the first time since leaving the plantation, he felt the edges of his fear soften. Here in this humble cabin was a kind of grace he had never expected to find. Ben leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Tomorrow night I'll take you to the next station. Folks there'll see you further along. But you'll need to be careful, son. The hounds'll still be out and the bounty hunters don't sleep easy when there's coin on the line. They'll paint you as a murderer, and maybe in the letter of the law that's true. But I reckon history will call you something else." Noah set his spoon down, his hand trembling slightly. "And what's that?" Ben's eyes met his, steady and solemn, a free man. The words settled over Noah like a mantle, heavy but fitting. He thought of Sarah, of Marcus, of the unborn child he would never see grow. He thought of the barn, the chains, the choice he had made. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine that his story might not end in a shallow grave or at the end of a rope. It might end in freedom, or at least in the knowledge that he had fought for it. That night, as he lay on a straw mattress beneath a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender, Noah stared at the flickering shadows on the ceiling and listened to the wind in the pines outside. Somewhere beyond those trees lay the north, a land he had never seen, but could almost picture a place where Marcus might grow up unbound, where Sarah might walk with her head high, where hope still unborn might take her first steps on free soil. For the first time since that October night, Noah Carter closed his eyes and let sleep take him not as a fugitive, not as a slave, but as a man moving steadily step by step toward freedom. The old man's voice carried the weight of memory as he spoke of his friend in Virginia, worked to the bone, beaten to death for moving too slow, reduced to nothing but property in the eyes of men who called themselves civilized. His fists trembled on the table as he admitted that he couldn't save his friend, but he could save others, and that vow had carried him through 15 years of dangerous work along the hidden roads north. Noah listened in silence, letting the story wash over him, like a tide reshaping everything he thought he knew about the world. To hear that a white man would risk his life to free black men and women was almost unthinkable. Yet here sat Ben Hartwell, offering food, clothes, and forged papers to a stranger, because he believed in a justice higher than the law. "What's the next step?" Noah asked at last. Ben smiled, disappearing into the back room and returning with a bundle of clothes, a hat, and a pouch of papers that bore official-looking seals. "Next step is you stop being Noah Carter. Name on these says William Johnson, free-colored man from South Carolina. Story is you're heading north to work with kinfolk in Cincinnati. Keep that straight, and you'll live to see the Ohio River." The name tasted foreign when Noah practiced it, but he knew it was his only shield now. William Johnson had a chance at life. Noah Carter was already marked for death. That night, Noah sank into the straw mattress, wrapped in blankets that smelled faintly of lavender. It was comfort, real comfort, and it tore at him almost as much as it soothed. Sleep brought Sarah's face at the window, Marcus's small hands holding carved animals, the weight of a daughter he might never know. He had left to protect them, but the emptiness of that choice pressed into his chest like a stone. At dawn, Ben explained the codes and signals of the Underground Railroad. A quilt patterned a certain way on a clothesline could mean safety. A candle in a window might point the way. A phrase whispered to the right stranger could open a door or close it forever. "Trust your gut," Ben told him. "If it feels wrong, run. Better to spend the night cold in the woods than back in chains, or dead." Noah nodded. Years of reading overseers' moods, of sensing danger before it fell, had honed instincts sharper than any blade. Now those instincts might carry him north. Before he left, Ben gave him paper and ink. Noah's hand shook as he shaped the words. The letters he had taught himself in secret, now spelling out the heart he had never been able to speak aloud. He told Sarah of his love, of his pride in Marcus, of his hope for the daughter yet unborn. He asked her to hold on to faith, to remember that somewhere under the same stars, he was still walking for them. Ben promised to see the letter delivered, though it might be months or years before it reached her hands. By the second night, Noah was gone from Ben's cabin, climbing through the ridges of northern Georgia under the cover of darkness. There the railroad carved its way through caves and trails, hidden deep in the mountains. Paths known only to a handful of guides who carried the lives of others in their hands. Every step forward felt like walking the razor's edge behind him, the men and dogs who would kill him without hesitation ahead of him, the faint promise of a land where his children might grow up free. Elizabeth greeted Noah with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Her boarding house stood at the edge of a small Tennessee town, its shutters painted a cheery blue, its sign advertising rooms for travelers and peddlers passing through. To the casual eye, it was nothing more than a respectable establishment run by a respectable woman. But behind its doors, it was one of the most important waypoints on the road to freedom. She ushered Noah through the back door rather than the front, directing him to the cellar. where a hidden room lay behind stacked barrels of cider. "You'll stay here during the day," she whispered. "Too many eyes in town. At night I'll get you further up the road." Her voice was calm, but her eyes carried the tension of someone who lived every day under the threat of discovery. For 2 days, Noah lay low in Elizabeth's cellar, listening to the sounds of boots on the street above the laughter of townsfolk, the creak of wagons, and once the sharp clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Elizabeth brought him food and water, speaking in clipped, practical tones. But in the evenings, when her boarders had retired, she sat with him and told him about the railroad's reach. "There are men and women like me from here clear to Canada," she explained one night, her knitting needles clicking softly in the lamplight. "Farmers, preachers, school teachers, even some who wear fine clothes and sit in pews beside the very men who'd hang them if they knew the truth. Most don't think of themselves as heroes. They just can't stand by and watch a lie destroy lives." Noah absorbed every word. The thought that ordinary people, black and white alike, were risking everything, so he might one day walk free, filling him with a sense of awe. It made his own struggle feel less lonely, as though he were part of an unseen army bound together by conviction. On his second night, Elizabeth handed him a fresh bundle of food and a new set of instructions. "There's a Quaker family north of here. They'll take you to the river crossing. But you must be careful. Slave catchers know this road, and they've been sniffing around more than usual. Keep to the shadows, and if anyone calls to you, don't answer unless they speak the password." Noah nodded, remembering Ben's words, Joshua's warnings. "Trust your instincts. Run if you must." That night, as he prepared to slip out the back and into the Tennessee dark, Elizabeth placed a hand on his arm. "You've come farther than most already. Don't lose heart now. Freedom's not just a dream, it's waiting for you if you can hold on." Her words clung to him as he vanished once more into the night, moving northward under the same stars that had guided him from Georgia. Each step carried him deeper into the dangerous heart of his journey, but also closer to the life he had never dared to believe possible. Noah sat by the fire long after Frederick had gone to bed, staring into the embers until they dimmed to ash. The carpenter's words had lit something inside him, a sharp ache almost unbearable. He could see Marcus's face in the firelight, curious eyes wide with the questions that had always frightened Noah to answer. He thought of the baby girl Sarah carried, the child who would be born into chains unless fate or rebellion tore those chains apart. Frederick's story showed him what was possible. A child who could dream, who could grow without the weight of slavery pressing down on every thought. But it also reminded him of the cruel distance between possibility and reality. His family was still trapped in the world he had left behind. The next morning, Elizabeth found Noah sitting at the kitchen table awake, but silent, his forged papers folded neatly before him. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You're thinking about the ones you left behind." Noah nodded. "Every step I take north, I wonder if I'm leaving them behind forever." Elizabeth poured him coffee and set it in front of him. "You are leaving them, but you're also clearing a path. Every life that makes it north, every man and woman who learns to live free, makes it easier for the next to follow. Don't think of it as abandoning them. Think of it as building something they might one day walk into." Her words didn't erase his guilt, but they gave it shape. For the first time, he began to understand that his journey wasn't just for him. It was a link in a chain, this one forged not of iron, but of defiance, carrying strength forward. That evening, Noah was given his next instructions. Frederick would accompany him part way toward the Ohio River, guiding him through the back roads and forests that flanked the Tennessee-Kentucky border. Beyond that lay the greatest danger, yet the wide churning river that divided slave states from free soil. Elizabeth clasped his hand firmly before he left. "Remember, William Johnson is who the world sees, but Noah Carter, he's who you're walking for. Don't let either one slip." With those words echoing in his ears, Noah stepped out into the night once more, his heart a knot of longing and determination. The road ahead was darker than ever, but the North Star still burned steady above him, promising a freedom he had begun to believe was real. The wind off the Ohio carried the scent of wet earth and wood smoke, a smell Noah would forever remember as the fragrance of freedom. Yet even as he stood on that northern bank, the truth pressed down on him. Freedom was not safety, nor was it certainty. It was responsibility. It was a fire he now carried, one he could not let die. At the safe house in Cincinnati, William Johnson was given a cot, a warm meal, and introductions to a community of free black men and women who had built lives in the shadow of constant danger. They welcomed him as a brother, though each of them knew that the reward posters nailed to tavern doors and courthouse boards still bore his likeness, still named him a murderer worth $1,000. But within that danger, Noah saw purpose. He thought of Joshua guiding strangers because of the sister he left behind. He thought of Elizabeth risking her home and livelihood to run a boarding house of hope. He thought of Jeremiah, pale but unflinching, as armed men searched his farm, willing to face ruin for the sake of a stranger's freedom. And he thought of Sarah Marcus and the unborn child he might never hold. The seed planted in him on the road north now blossomed into conviction. Freedom was not just for himself. It was something to be shared, something to be fought for, something that demanded more of him than survival. Weeks later, William Johnson found work in a carpentry shop, laboring with his hands, as he always had, but now with wages of his own choosing. At night, in secret meetings lit by candles in basements and back rooms, he listened to others speak of resistance, of rescuing fugitives, of building schools and churches where none had existed before. Slowly, Noah Carter, the man who had walked away from the Pierce plantation in chains, became William Johnson, the man who worked to break the chains of others. His past could never be erased. Jonathan Pierce's face still haunted him, as did the screams of those he had avenged with each strike of the whip. But in that haunting lay purpose. His violence had not been the end of his story, but the beginning of it. Standing one evening on the banks of the Ohio, Noah looked back toward the dark southern horizon. He knew his family was still there under the weight of bondage. He knew he might never see them again. But he also knew that every step he took forward, every person he helped along the railroad, every choice he made as William Johnson carved out a possibility that someday Marcus, Hope, and Sarah might walk free on northern soil. The story of Noah Carter, the enslaved man who killed his master, ended on the southern bank of the Ohio River. The story of William Johnson, the free man who chose to carry the fire of liberation, had only just begun.